Good afternoon. I have a late-breaking paper title change. It's actually Dewey's Pragmatism Extended, Education and Aesthetic Practice in Train Whistle Guitar. Albert Murray readily acknowledges a debt to Tuskegee's, Alabama's Tuskegee Institute, as it was there he began the process that led to his becoming a writer and all-purpose literary intellectual. He recalls not courses especially, but rather Tuskegee's marvelous library as the site of his real learning while at college. His major in education, he just did on the side. Taking their cue from Murray, scholars and interviewers have so far ignored the influence of Murray's coursework in education on his original approach to American culture and aesthetic theory. But because Murray did take this coursework seriously, which his decision to pursue graduate work in education for a term at the University of Michigan supports, it might serve us Murrayites well to pause here for a moment to consider how perhaps that major in education provided a foundation for Murray's startling originality. The education curriculum at Tuskegee endorsed one theorist in particular, John Dewey, the leading proponent of progressive education, which de-emphasized transmitting knowledge to students as passive receptors in favor of structuring the learning environment so that students would be active participants. Murray was so intrigued by what he learned about Dewey in the classroom that, as he told Robert O'Mealy, on his own he investigated Dewey's work further. What he discovered was that Dewey's progressive positions on education grew out of the larger philosophical framework of American pragmatism, which Dewey himself helped found. Deweyan pragmatism is based on the assumption that all philosophical questions are rooted in ordinary lived experience. Following from that, something like truth is no longer immutable, divorced from lived experience, but rather shaped by time and circumstances. Human existence can be recognized itself as a condition of contingency and plurality, shaping and shaped by the natural and social environment, and rigid compartmentalization, separating human beings into body versus mind, education into teaching versus learning, art into fine versus useful, is the enemy of understanding and social progress. These positions made such an impression on Murray that among the first books he acquired for his own library were Dewey's 1934 treatise on aesthetics, Art as Experience, and The Philosophy of John Dewey, a 1939 scholarly overview. Both books remained on Murray's shelves throughout his writing career. My argument in a longer work is that Murray's encounters with Dewey's ideas while an undergraduate had a lasting effect on his thinking. While deeply embedded in his work, they can still be teased out, suggesting that Murray should himself be seen as a contributor to and shaper of the intellectual tradition of pragmatism, a distinctively American mode of thought and arguably our country's major addition to philosophy. Murray's contributions are evident in two great themes of his work: education, hearkening back to that undergraduate major, and aesthetics, Murray's preoccupation out of the classroom while at Tuskegee. Two themes that come together so well in his first novel, Train Whistle Guitar, as to allow readers to conclude themselves what Murray argues in all his work. Contrary to the dominant mid-20th century representation of the African American community as victimized and degraded outside the mainstream of American culture, Black U.S. culture is the quintessential American culture. Those who claim the culture and are shaped by it possess a heightened openness to change, which, as adaptability, just happens to be the human trait on which Dewey's pragmatism is based. When extended and refined through experience, with education being a crucial dimension of experience, that African American openness to change becomes art, indispensable equipment for coping with contemporary life. To see how Train Whistle Guitar accomplishes this requires setting out some of the major points Dewey makes about education, beginning with his technical definition. Education is, quote, that reconstruction or reorganization of experience which adds to the meaning of experience and which increases ability to direct the course of subsequent experience, end quote. Such reconstructing or reorganizing occurs through communication, which for Dewey is a process of sharing experience till it becomes a common possession. This educative process occurs formally and informally, in and out of school, and how to keep a proper balance between the informal and formal, Dewey sees as, quote, one of the weightiest problems with which a philosophy of education has to cope, end quote. For while he recognizes that societies, in growing more complex, increasingly rely on formal schooling, he warns of the creation of an undesirable split between the experience gained in more direct associations and what is acquired in school. Their integration, he sees, is crucial for the ongoing renewal of a social group. For a social group to renew itself, Dewey explains, does not mean it simply repeats its history. This is where formal schooling plays such an important role. In a democracy, he argues, it is the office of the school environment to see to it that each individual gets an opportunity to escape from the limitations of the social group in which he was born and to come into living contact with a broader environment. By developing a curriculum that integrates subject matter with social context, schools allow for students to develop, quote, better habits than those of the social group's current adult society, end quote. The pedagogy required for developing such habits requires that students be fully enlisted in doing something, while the educator makes sure, quote, that the doing requires observation, the acquisition of information, and the use of constructive imagination, end quote. The subjects that lend themselves best to this mode, according to Dewey, are geography and history, which function to enrich and liberate. They are, quote, the two great school resources for bringing about the enlargement of the significance of a direct personal experience, end quote. The premise of Train Whistle Guitar suggests Dewey's technical definition of education. The novel is Scooter's narration of significant events and people from his childhood, spent in Gasoline Point, Alabama, small all-black community outside of Mobile. The reader understands Scooter as narrator to be an adult, removed from Gasoline Point in time and geography. His reflection on past events is a reconstructing or reorganizing through memory of experience, and it is in this reconstructing that his experiences gain meaning. For both Murray and Dewey, if education begins with the reconstructing of experience, which, by the way, Murray does say outright in the Omni-Americans, but without an attribution to Dewey, so too does art. According to Dewey, art is everyday experience intensified and refined. Murray's related definition is that art is a stylization of experience through a process of extension, elaboration, and refinement. According to both men, the goal of such aesthetic practice is to give meaning to past experience that in turn suggests possibilities for the future, indicating that they also see art as a subset of education, or at times, education as a subset of art. As Murray says in the Omni-Americans, teaching is an art, a fine art. The overall structure of Train Whistle Guitar sets up an environment conducive for learning, with two different sets of teachers and learners. On one level, Scooter is both teacher and pupil, as his retelling of the past gives it a meaning for him that he uses to direct his future endeavors, which we see played out in the other Scooter novels. On another level, Murray the artist is teacher, and we, the readers, are the learners. When we focus on Scooter as the teacher and learner, we see key elements of Dewey's educational philosophy concretized. The novel begins with Scooter recalling his beloved Chinaberry tree, and the brief chapters that follow introduce Little Buddy, Scooter's best friend, and Louisiana Charlie, the nomadic guitar-playing bluesman idolized by Scooter and Little Buddy. Those chapters are concerned with two adventures the young boys have. In one, they hop a train leaving town in imitation of Louisiana Charlie, and another, they set out on foot for the nearby shipyards. Formal schooling, while clearly in the background, is still woven through these early chapters. Scooter recreates how Louisiana Charlie, after discovering the boys in an empty boxcar and returning them to Gasoline Point by way of a slow-poking local, recognizes his responsibility to correct his young admirer's romantic view of his wandering life. He tells them to stay in school because they were, quote, to take what they were already born with and learn to put it with everything the civil engineers and inventors and doctors and lawyers and bookkeepers had found out about the world so that they could bring about the day the old folks had always been prophesying and praying for, end quote. His parting words to the boys: make old Luz proud of you. You going further than old Luz ever dreamed of. Old Luz ain't been nowhere. Old Luz don't know from nothing. There we have Dewey's ideal educative process, whereby experience is shared and reconstructed. The reconstruction is put into motion through Luzanachali's instruction, who surely knows more than the nothing he claims, as he embraces another aspect of Dewey's educational philosophy. If the social group to which the boys belong, the Southern black rural community, is to renew itself, it must not repeat Luzanachali's choices, as romantic as they might seem. He knows that school provides the boys with the opportunities they need, introducing them to the broader environment necessary to bring about the change the community needs. In Scooter's recounting of the book's second adventure, a day he and little Buddy played hooky to head out for the shipyards, he reveals how formal schooling was never far from his mind. As young boys would, Scooter and little Buddy celebrate their freedom in a playful call and response that appears to dismiss the importance of school. Hey, that's all right about your goddamn school, little Buddy said. Hey, call us the goddamn school this time. We got your goddamn school, I said. I got your goddamn school right here. Michael Borshuk reads that as a jazz-like critique of social convention, formal schooling, which clearly on its surface it is. But underlying that bravura performance is Scooter's guilty conscience, which alters the meaning to be taken from it. Scooter recalls how, walking through the woods, the boys could hear the morning's last school bell. I quote, "But schoolboy that I was even then, as faint as the bell sound was, the minute I heard it, I could also feel the way I always felt and see them lining up at the flagpole. And I couldn't keep myself from knowing exactly how long it would be before the Pledge of Allegiance and the High Society March would be over, and Miss Lexing Metcalf would be calling my name twice and looking up before marking me tardy." The informal experience of sneaking out to the shipyards and the formal experience of school, no matter Scooter's boyhood desire, remain intertwined. This balance between the informal and formal modes of education is especially apparent during Scooter's recollection of the communal fireside gatherings at his home. With Scooter always in the same chair in his same place in the corner, the adults tell stories about John Henry, Stagger Lee and Billy Lyons, Railroad Bill. From these stories, the conversation would turn more philosophical and broadly historical, to freedom and the Civil War and on to Reconstruction, which Scooter tells us would inevitably lead to the topic of education. And he recalls that as he grew older, these fireside conversations would come to focus on him as the hope and glory because of his progress at school. Scooter's school seems to have had in place in the 1920s precisely the sort of curriculum Dewey was calling for in 1916 when he published Democracy in Education. Central to the curriculum of Scooter's all-black school, we learn, were geography and history, Dewey's two great resources for bringing about the enlargement of the significance of a direct personal experience. When remembering how he would be invited to share with his elders evidence of the education he was getting, Scooter recalls, quote, "Sometimes it was geography, sometimes it was history. Sometimes I had to tell it, sometimes I had to get the book and read it to them." He would read or recite from the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, Frederick Douglass's orations, even Poor Richard's Almanac. Once one of the townsfolk rewarded Scooter with a $5 bill, proclaiming, "We all gonna be drawing down interest on him." Not to be outdone, Scooter's Uncle Jerome that day stood to preach a sermon about his nephew, which led Scooter to look at the mantelpiece that held an old-fashioned pendulum clock. The clock, Scooter tells us earlier, quote, "was Papa's heirloom from that ancestral mansion of antebellum columns and gingham crisp kitchens in which his mulatto grandmother had herself been an inherited slave until Sherman's march to the sea. but which I still remember as a Mother Goose clock, end quote. The day of his uncle's sermon, Scooter, quote, heard the Mother Goose clock, and outside there was the Valley Forge bitter wind and the turret tall chinaberry tree, end quote. Informal and formal schooling combine, allowing Scooter to expand his own history beyond his immediate experience so that his context can include not only his parents and their parents' past, but the entire nation's, going back to the Revolutionary War. Another example of how vernacular experience and formal schooling combine. From town elder Uncle Jojo the African, Scooter initially learns of the Clotilda, which had carried to the U.S. one of the last, if not the very last, shipload of African captives, Uncle Jojo among them. His understanding grows from thinking it was a reference to the Old Testament story of Jonah and the whale, to it being a United Fruit Company boat, to realizing it was a slave ship once he, quote, finally began to pay close enough attention during the New Year's Day ceremonies celebrating the Emancipation Proclamation, end quote. But still missing was a large enough context for him to fully grasp Uncle Jojo's story until he was introduced to geography in the formal environment of the classroom, symbolized by his third grade teacher's, quote, blue and green and yellow globe revolving on its tilted axis, end quote. Only upon learning to use the globe for Miss Lexing Metcalf did Scooter realize that Uncle Jojo was talking about coming all the way across the Atlantic Ocean from another continent in another hemisphere. From then on, having come into contact with the broader environment that Dewey argues it is the progressive school's responsibility to provide, Scooter was, quote, to become a schoolboy above and beyond everything else. For all the absolutely indispensable times, he was still to play hooky with little Buddy Marshall, end quote. Scooter's reflection suggests formal schooling does have a role to play that is distinct from the education one gains informally. It provides the tools and knowledge for individuals to remake or create the selves they can imagine, regardless of parents or personal history. Only what Dewey calls a student's basic equipment matters. Education must take individuals as they are, he writes. That a particular individual has just such and such an equipment of native abilities is a basic fact. That they were produced in such and such a way, or that they are derived from one's ancestry, is not especially important. Or, as Scooter rephrases what he learned from Miss T, there was no family name or ancestral bloodlines of identity and inheritance that was likely to stand you in much better stead than the also and also of the background you could create for yourself by always doing your best in school. A profound lesson Scooter's reordering of his story makes plain. The book reveals late that Miss T, the woman taken to be a family friend, is Scooter's biological mother. Who his father is remains a mystery. The lesson this reorganizing points up is that Scooter must and can create himself. Reordering chronology moves us into the specifically aesthetic dimension of train whistle guitar and to the second teacher-learner configuration. Murray is artist-teacher, readers as learners. We recall that for both Dewey and Murray, the basic stuff of art is everyday experience, and such experience becomes art once it is reworked, much like experience must be reconstructed to become educative. Restoring a relationship between the everyday and art was radical when Dewey published Art as Experience. Murray, however, could assume that continuity and extend it, which we see when he argues in his essays that U.S. blacks in the 20th century have made a profound contribution to the world's equipment for living through the invention of a blues aesthetic, crystallized in jazz that derives from the black community's vernacular culture. But as much as Murray values music and discursive argumentation, his bias toward such literary forms as novels and poetry rivals that of Dewey, who in Art as Experience claims that these forms not only, quote, have an intellectual force superior to that of any other art, but also have the capacity to present the values of a collective life, end quote. That bias, then, sets a tall order for Murray's fiction. There should be his fullest communication that U.S. black culture holds the aesthetic values the nation collectively needs to renew itself in contemporary times. To see that in train whistle guitar, let's go first to the novel's structure, which overall suggests blues-based jazz. It opens with a vamp, the short introduction that starts off a jazz tune. Devoted to the Chinaberry tree, this vamp is followed by one of 5 italicized sections that function much like musical riffs, short musical phrases that repeat throughout a tune, typically with slight but important variations. These riffs take as their focus the actual and potential of Scooter's identity. He's Jack the Rabbit of the Briar Patch, or the schoolboy, or a cultural hero like Jack Johnson. Between these riffs are narrations of incidents, and in form, they suggest jazz solos or ensemble playing, such as when the townsfolk gathered at his parents' fireside build a story. With any of these, vamp, riff, solo, or ensemble, blues and jazz elements translated to literary form appear. Early in one paragraph of the opening vamp, we get the AAB structure of the blues lyric stanza. From the Chinaberry tree, you couldn't see the post office flag, and you couldn't see the switch sidings for the sawmills, but you could see the telegraph poles and the sky above the Pine Ridge. This AAB structure is broadened out over the rest of the vamp, so that a later paragraph begins, you couldn't see the blackberry slopes, and 2 paragraphs later, nor could you see 1 Mile Bridge. But in the next paragraph, you could see the sky above Bay Poplar Woods fading away. As readers, we experience that structure, gradually recognizing the artifice while engaging our imaginations with the seen and unseen. In our role as students, we are fully enlisted in doing something, while Murray, the artist teacher, has made sure that the doing requires observation, the acquisition of information, and the constructive use of imagination. But because what we experience is the stylized blues form deliberately and fully imposed upon the raw particulars of a landscape, it moves beyond educative to being an aesthetic experience. For Dewey, an aesthetic experience is not a political experience. When artists set out to convey a special message, Dewey explains, they limit the expressiveness of the material they have shaped. Murray has long been committed to and criticized for that same view of art, but he extends Dewey to clarify that art nonetheless has political significance and applicability. Yet, because art is concerned with what Murray says is, quote, the essential nature of existence among a given folk in a given community, end quote, it establishes the context for, rather than prescribes, social and political action. Murray's artist functions much like Dewey's teacher, who in being responsible for supplying the conditions which ensure growth through conjoint activities, empowers rather than dictates. As a series of riffs and little stories lacking in traditional narrative links, Train Whistle Guitar suggests rather than announces its meaning. The connections between the stories are loose, with an element of one being picked up by the next, much in the way the instruments of a jazz ensemble respond to each other. One chapter of the book, containing 6 little stories, has as its basic theme how the sacred and secular of Sunday and Monday in Gasoline Point are intertwined, with the last little story focusing on Blue Eula Bacote. Let's pause for a moment on Blue Eula, for here Murray captures so well the essential nature of existence among a given folk in a given community, laying the groundwork for social and political action. Childless and married to a good man who is also a gambler, Ms. Bacote has her share of life's hardships, and they can get to her. Hello Central, hello Central, hello Central, ring me Western Union, she can be heard saying to herself sometimes at the local honky-tonk. But she also always used to wear high-heel patent leather pumps and spang-dangling 18-karat gold earrings, and used to have the best short, plump, brown-skinned strut you ever saw. On Monday mornings, she would clean her whole house, listening to Bessie Smith or Ma Rainey or Louis Armstrong, so that by the middle of the day, after putting her clean house back together, quote, it was as if she had finally gotten everything ready to make it through another week, end quote. Blue Eula is the affirmative beat that is always geared to the rugged facts of life, a beat, Murray tells us, always underlying the blues. Put another way, Blue Eula Bacote, an ordinary woman in the Black South of the early 20th century, improvises a means of coping with the low-down, dirty shame of her life. She has a look, a walk, and a general routine indicating not only that she has the ability to adapt, the human trait underlying Deweyan pragmatism, but that she has elevated her ability to improvise to a lifestyle. Then by pairing her actions with the music of such jazz innovators as Bessie Smith and Louis Armstrong, Murray reminds us of the continuity between everyday experience and art that Dewey sought to restore in the 1930s. Because that reminder is made by using a black character's experience and a style of music invented by black musicians in the US, it also takes on political significance, serving in 1974 as a counterstatement to the lingering mid-20th century view of African American culture as impoverished and degraded, since a culture that gives rise to an art style which Murray calls the highest as well as the most comprehensive fulfillment of culture can hardly be a degraded culture. But when we also consider how Murray has embraced Dewey's principle that the force of art is realized through the audience's experiencing of its form, we get to Murray's great achievement with the novel. To be sure, Murray indicates through Blue Ullapacote's story that black culture has significant claim on the origins of jazz and the art it represents. And he is adamant in his essays that that fact needs to be respected. But Murray encases Blue Eula's story and the message regarding the vitality of black culture in a form that not only functions as a translation of blues-based jazz elements into literary technique, but through its improvisatory texture encourages our participation as readers. The effect of this is profound. Rather than claiming the style to be the exclusive property of the black community, as some have criticized Murray for doing, he invites all of us, no matter our background, to experience it as our common possession. Thank you.